Chapter 1. A Chance Meeting. In the heart of the bustling city, the air was crisp with the scent of autumn. The leaves fell like soft confetti, swirling in golden hues, coating the ground in a warm blanket of nature's farewell. Eleanor walked along the familiar streets, her long brown coat swaying gently with each step. The city had become her sanctuary, a place where she could lose herself in the hum of life, unnoticed and unbothered. The early morning light filtered through the buildings, casting long shadows on the pavement as she made her way to the small cafe she often visited. It was tucked away on a quiet corner, a hidden gem amidst the chaos of city life. Its warm, inviting glow felt like home in a world that was too fast, too overwhelming. Eleanor liked the solitude it offered, the moments where she could sit and let her thoughts drift, watching the world move on without her. Inside, the smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the sweetness of pastries. She found her usual spot by the window, the one where the light danced on the table as the hours passed. She settled into her chair, pulling a book from her bag, its worn edges familiar in her hands. She opened it to the marked page, but her eyes drifted, gazing out the window instead. Across the street, a figure caught her attention. A man, about her age, stood at the crosswalk, his face partially hidden beneath the brim of his hat. He seemed lost, as if the world around him didn't quite fit. His dark coat contrasted sharply with the brightness of the day, making him a shadow amidst the light. Something about him felt familiar, though Eleanor couldn't place where she had seen him before. As the light changed, the man stepped forward, his pace steady yet unhurried. There was a softness in his movements, a calm that was rare in the rush of city life. His eyes wandered, scanning the street, until they settled on the cafe. For a brief moment, their eyes met through the glass. A flicker of recognition passed between them, though neither had ever spoken a word. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat, a strange sensation of déjà vu sweeping over her. She watched as the man approached the cafe, his steps measured, his gaze unwavering. He reached for the door, pushing it open with a quiet grace. The bell above the door chimed softly, the sound barely noticeable in the quiet hum of the morning. He walked in, his eyes briefly scanning the room before they fell on Eleanor again. There was a moment, just a heartbeat, where the world seemed to slow. He didn't smile, didn't acknowledge her beyond that fleeting glance, but something passed between them. An unspoken understanding, a connection that neither could explain. He moved to the counter, ordering something before finding a seat at the far end of the cafe. Eleanor's eyes followed him, though she pretended to be absorbed in her book. Her fingers traced the edges of the pages, but her mind was elsewhere, caught in the lingering gaze of a stranger. Time seemed to stretch as they sat on opposite ends of the room, separated by distance, but connected in a way that words couldn't define. The cafe filled slowly, the quiet murmur of voices rising, but for Eleanor, the world had narrowed down to that singular presence. The man never looked her way again, but she felt his presence like a steady rhythm, a pulse that matched her own. When she finally gathered her things to leave, her movements were slow, deliberate, as though reluctant to break the fragile thread that tied them together. As she stepped outside, the chill of the autumn air greeted her again, but it felt different, sharper, more alive. She glanced back through the window, her eyes searching for the stranger. He was still there, sitting quietly, his focus seemingly elsewhere. And yet, as she turned away, she knew this wasn't the last time she would see him. Something in her heart whispered that their paths had only just begun to cross. Eleanor walked down the street, her pace quickening, though her thoughts lingered behind. The world around her continued, but something had shifted. The chance meeting, the fleeting connection, had planted a seed of something unknown. The air seemed to hum with the possibilities, as if the city itself knew more than she did. And so, With a heart heavy with a strange, inexplicable longing, Eleanor continued on, unaware of how that brief moment would change her life forever. Chapter 2. Stolen Glances. The days passed slowly after that morning, though the memory of the stranger in the cafe lingered in Eleanor's mind. She tried to push it away, dismissing it as a fleeting curiosity, yet it returned with a quiet insistence each time she walked past the cafe or found herself lost in thought. It was as if his presence had left an invisible imprint on her, one that she couldn't quite shake. Her routine remained unchanged. Mornings spent walking through the city, afternoons at her job in a small bookstore, evenings spent reading or wandering the streets. But now, there was an unspoken anticipation with each day, a subtle hope that she might see him again, though she told herself it was irrational. It wasn't until a week later that she spotted him again, once more at the cafe. She had arrived earlier than usual, the morning fog still thick in the air, casting a soft haze over the world. The streets were quiet, the city not yet fully awake, and Eleanor welcomed the silence as she entered the cafe. To her surprise, he was already there, sitting in the same seat as before, his dark coat draped over the back of his chair. His presence startled her, though she hid it well, pretending to focus on the counter as she ordered her usual drink. She could feel his eyes on her, though she didn't dare look directly at him. Taking her usual spot by the window, Eleanor settled into her chair, her hands resting on the table as she stared out at the quiet street. She could see his reflection in the glass, a faint outline against the light filtering through the cafe. He wasn't looking at her, not directly, but there was a subtle awareness between them, a quiet energy that pulsed in the air. She opened her book, but her attention was elsewhere, her thoughts drifting back to him. He seemed as lost in thought as she was, his gaze distant, as if he were waiting for something or someone. There was a calmness to him, an ease in the way he sat, as though the world outside couldn't touch him. And yet, there was also a quiet intensity, a sense of something hidden beneath the surface. Time passed in slow, quiet moments. Eleanor sipped her coffee, pretending to read, but her mind was only half-focused. She stole glances at him through the reflection, brief, cautious looks that she hoped went unnoticed. Each time her eyes flickered toward him, her heart quickened, though she couldn't explain why. The cafe remained quiet, save for the occasional clink of a cup or the soft murmur of voices. Outside, the fog began to lift, revealing the world beyond in muted colors. The familiar hum of the city was starting to return, but inside, it felt as if they were in a world all their own, untouched by the noise and chaos. Eleanor shifted in her seat, turning a page in her book though she hadn't truly read a word. Her eyes wandered once more to the reflection, only to find that he was now looking at her. The realization made her heart skip a beat, her breath catching in her chest. His gaze was steady, calm, as if he had been watching her for longer than she knew. She froze, unsure of what to do, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't quite catch. Should she look away? Acknowledge him? But before she could decide, he turned his gaze back to the table, his fingers lightly tracing the edge of his cup. The moment passed as quickly as it had come, but the effect lingered. There was something magnetic in those stolen glances, something that made the air between them feel charged, alive. It was a strange, almost unsettling feeling, yet it drew her in, compelling her to stay. She wasn't sure what it meant, this unspoken connection that seemed to hum between them, but it was there, undeniable and growing with each passing moment. As the morning wore on, Eleanor found herself more and more distracted by his presence. She hadn't spoken a word to him, hadn't exchanged anything beyond brief, stolen glances, yet she felt as if she knew him, or at least, that she was meant to. There was a pull, an invisible thread tying them together in ways she couldn't explain. When she finally rose to leave, her movements were slow, deliberate, as if part of her didn't want to break the fragile thread that had formed between them. She gathered her things, pausing for a moment as she stood by her chair, her eyes flickering toward him one last time. He didn't look up, but she could feel the weight of his presence, even as she turned toward the door. Stepping outside, the cool air greeted her, refreshing against her warm skin. She walked down the street, her mind replaying the stolen glances, the quiet moments shared across the cafe. It was a strange sensation, this lingering connection, but she knew it wasn't something she could easily forget. As she made her way through the city, her thoughts kept returning to him. Who was he? What was it about him that made her feel this way, as though they were somehow connected by more than just coincidence? She had never been one to believe in fate, but this felt different, as though something larger was at play. Eleanor continued on, her feet carrying her through the familiar streets as her mind wandered through unfamiliar thoughts. The world around her remained unchanged, but something within her had shifted. The chance encounter had sparked something, a quiet flame that burned brighter with each stolen glance. And though she didn't know what the future held, she couldn't shake the feeling that their paths would cross again. There was something unfinished between them, something waiting to be discovered. The connection, however fleeting, had left its mark, and Eleanor knew it was only the beginning. Chapter 3. Unspoken Longing. The city continued its relentless pace, but for Eleanor, time seemed to slow whenever she found herself near the cafe. The memories of her brief encounters with the stranger became a quiet obsession, filling the empty spaces of her days with thoughts she couldn't shake. She didn't know his name, didn't know anything about him, but there was a pull, an invisible force that tugged at her each time she walked those familiar streets. Another week had passed since their last shared moment, yet the weight of his presence still lingered in her mind. She found herself returning to the cafe more often, not consciously seeking him out, but always hoping to see him again. The routine she once cherished, the quiet mornings, the comfort of solitude, now felt incomplete without the chance of crossing paths with him. One crisp afternoon, Eleanor decided to visit the cafe later than usual. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light over the city as the sky shifted from blue to hues of orange and pink. She hadn't planned to stay long, but the soft glow of the evening sky called to her, pulling her toward the familiar space she had come to associate with him. The streets were quieter at this hour, the rush of the day giving way to the calm of early evening. As she approached the cafe, she hesitated, her heart quickening at the thought of seeing him again. She told herself it was foolish. After all, they had exchanged nothing but glances, and yet there was a small, stubborn part of her that believed in the unspoken connection they shared. Pushing open the door, she stepped inside, her eyes immediately scanning the room. The cafe was emptier than usual, with only a few people scattered among the tables. Her heart sank slightly when she didn't see him, but she pushed the feeling aside, focusing instead on finding a seat. She chose a table near the back this time, away from the window but still within view of the door. The soft hum of conversation filled the space, but Eleanor barely noticed it. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying those stolen moments from before, wondering if they had meant as much to him as they had to her. She ordered her usual drink, her fingers tapping absent-mindedly on the table as she waited. The golden light from outside filtered through the large windows, casting long shadows that danced across the floor. The warmth of the cafe wrapped around her, but it did little to soothe the quiet ache that had taken root inside her. As she sat there, her thoughts drifting, the bell above the door chimed softly. Eleanor didn't look up at first, lost in the maze of her own mind. But then, as if guided by some invisible thread, she felt a shift in the air, a subtle change that made her heart race. She glanced toward the door, and there he was, just as she remembered him. The dark coat, the quiet grace with which he moved, the calm presence that seemed to envelop him. Her breath caught in her chest as their eyes met, the connection between them sparking to life once more. He stood still for a moment, as if deciding whether to stay or go. The hesitation was brief, but Eleanor felt it deeply, as though their fates hung in the balance of that single moment. Then, without breaking eye contact, he stepped further into the cafe, his movements slow, deliberate. Eleanor's heart raced as he walked past her, his presence close enough that she could feel the faint brush of air as he moved by. He didn't stop, didn't sit at the table beside her, but instead chose one near the front, by the window. It was almost as if he were mirroring her earlier visits, sitting in the seat she had once occupied. She watched him, her gaze soft but intense, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. Why did he keep appearing in her life, in these quiet, fleeting moments that left her breathless? Was it coincidence? Or was there something more to it, something beyond her control? He settled into his seat, his back to her, but Eleanor could still feel the connection between them, as though an invisible line stretched across the room, binding them together. She tried to focus on her drink, on the world around her, but it was no use. Her thoughts kept circling back to him, the mystery of his presence wrapping itself around her like a fog. For the next hour, they remained in the same space, two strangers bound by something neither could define. Eleanor stole glances at him whenever she could, her heart fluttering each time she caught a glimpse of his profile in the fading light. He, too, seemed aware of her, though he never turned to meet her gaze directly. The cafe slowly emptied as the evening wore on, the soft glow of the streetlights outside casting a warm glow over the tables. The air between them felt thick with unspoken words, with feelings neither could name. Eleanor wanted to approach him, to close the distance between them, but something held her back. A fear of breaking whatever delicate connection they had, of shattering the quiet magic that seemed to exist in those unspoken moments. As the night deepened, Eleanor knew it was time to leave. She gathered her things slowly, her heart heavy with the weight of everything left unsaid. She stood, pausing for a moment by her chair, her eyes drifting toward him one last time. To her surprise, he stood as well, moving toward the door at the same time as her. Their movements mirrored one another, as if choreographed by some unseen hand. As they stepped outside, the cool night air washed over them, sharp and crisp against their skin. Eleanor glanced at him, her heart pounding in her chest. For a brief moment, their eyes met once more, and in that gaze, there was something more. A longing, a quiet desire that neither could voice but both understood. It was there, in the way his eyes softened when they met hers, in the way her breath caught in her throat at the sight of him. They stood there, on the edge of something unspoken, something that hovered between them like the night air. And then, as if pulled by the same invisible force, they turned and walked away, each heading in opposite directions, their paths diverging once again. But as Eleanor walked through the quiet streets, her mind replayed that final glance, the look in his eyes that mirrored the longing in her own. She knew this wasn't the end. There was something unfinished between them, something waiting to be discovered in the spaces between their unspoken moments. And though the city was vast, and their lives separate, Eleanor felt a quiet certainty settle in her heart. Their paths would cross again. The longing, the connection, it was too strong to be denied. It was only a matter of time. Chapter 4. Echoes of the Past. The city was bathed in the soft light of early morning when Eleanor found herself returning to the familiar streets once more. The crisp air carried the scent of freshly brewed coffee and the faint hum of the waking world. Yet, despite the calm of the morning, Eleanor's thoughts were anything but still. Ever since their last encounter, the stranger had haunted her mind like a quiet melody that wouldn't leave her. His eyes, the unspoken connection they shared, the way their paths seemed to converge and diverge so effortlessly, it all lingered, refusing to fade. And though they had never exchanged a single word, something deep inside her had shifted. She had begun to wonder about the life he led beyond their brief encounters, the moments that made up his days when they weren't silently observing one another. Who was he, really? What was his story, his purpose? The questions swirled around her constantly, unanswered but persistent. Eleanor hadn't seen him for days, and though she told herself it didn't matter, that it was just a fleeting connection, she couldn't ignore the pull she felt each time she passed the cafe. She had begun taking different routes, walking farther and farther away from her usual paths, but it never helped. Somehow, she always ended up back where they had first crossed paths, as if drawn there by some invisible force. This morning, though, she had come with purpose. She told herself it wasn't about him, that she was simply following her routine, but deep down, she knew better. There was a quiet hope in her heart, a yearning for the unexpected, the possibility of seeing him again. As she entered the cafe, her heart quickened, a familiar thrill of anticipation curling in her chest. She scanned the room, her eyes searching for him even before she realized she was doing it. But the cafe was empty, save for a few early risers sipping their coffee in silence. Disappointment settled in her stomach, but she pushed it aside, taking her usual seat by the window. The minutes stretched on, and though Eleanor tried to lose herself in the book she had brought with her, her mind wandered. She sipped her coffee absent-mindedly, her thoughts drifting to memories she hadn't visited in a long time. Memories of a different time, a different place. Years ago, long before the city had become her refuge, there had been someone else. Someone who had once filled her heart with the same quiet longing, the same sense of unspoken connection. His name had been Nathan. Nathan had been a part of her life in ways that no one else ever had. Their love had been fierce, passionate, but also fragile, like a fire that burned too hot, too bright. They had been young, too young to understand that some connections, no matter how strong, weren't meant to last forever. She hadn't thought of Nathan in a long time, but now, sitting in the quiet cafe, the memories came rushing back. The way he used to look at her, the way their laughter had filled the spaces between them, the way their love had consumed them both until there was nothing left. It had ended suddenly, painfully. One day, Nathan was there, and the next, he was gone, leaving behind only echoes of what once was. The hurt had been too deep, the loss too profound, and Eleanor had spent years trying to heal, to forget. But some things couldn't be forgotten. Some connections, no matter how broken, left their mark. She hadn't thought about him in years, and yet, the stranger, the man whose name she didn't even know, had brought those memories back to the surface. There was something about him, something familiar in the way he moved, the way his presence lingered in her thoughts. It reminded her of the way she had once felt with Nathan, the way their connection had felt like fate. Eleanor closed her book, unable to focus on the words any longer. The memories of Nathan swirled in her mind, mixing with the thoughts of the stranger, creating a confusing blend of past and present. It was as if the two were connected somehow, though she couldn't explain how or why. She rose from her seat, suddenly restless. The cafe felt too small, too confining, and she needed to escape the weight of her thoughts. She stepped outside, the cold air biting at her skin, but it did little to clear the fog in her mind. As she walked through the city streets, her pace quickened, her heart racing with emotions she couldn't fully understand. The memories of Nathan, the longing for the stranger, they collided within her, leaving her feeling raw and vulnerable. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected to be so affected by a man she didn't even know. The streets blurred as she walked, her feet carrying her farther and farther from the cafe. She wandered without direction, her thoughts heavy, her heart aching with the weight of everything she had tried to bury. Eventually, she found herself in a park she hadn't visited in years. It was a small, quiet place, tucked away from the bustling streets of the city. She and Nathan had once spent countless hours here, talking about everything and nothing, dreaming of a future that would never come to pass. Eleanor sat down on a bench, the memories overwhelming her. She hadn't allowed herself to grieve for Nathan, not fully. She had buried the pain, hidden it away, but now, it seemed to rise to the surface, demanding to be felt. And yet, as the memories of Nathan flooded her, they were accompanied by thoughts of the stranger, the man who had appeared in her life so unexpectedly, so quietly. There was something about him that stirred the same emotions she had once felt for Nathan, the same sense of possibility, of connection. But there was also a fear that this too could end as suddenly as it had begun, leaving her with nothing but more echoes of the past. Eleanor sat in the park for what felt like hours, lost in her thoughts. The city moved around her, but she remained still, her heart heavy with the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the present. She didn't know what to do, didn't know how to make sense of the emotions that swirled inside her. Eventually, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park. The day was ending, but Eleanor felt as though she were standing at the beginning of something new, something unknown and terrifying, but also filled with quiet hope. As she rose from the bench and began to make her way back through the city, she couldn't help but wonder what the future held. Would she see him again? Would their paths continue to cross in those quiet, unspoken moments? And if they did, what would it mean for her? For the part of her that was still healing, still grieving? Only time would tell. But as she walked through the fading light, Eleanor felt a quiet certainty in her heart. She wasn't done with him, and he wasn't done with her. Their story, whatever it was far from over. Chapter 5. Threads of Fate. Days stretched into weeks, and though Eleanor's life carried on in the usual rhythm, the stranger was never far from her thoughts. The city, with all its familiar corners, seemed to whisper of him, of the unspoken connection that hung between them like a thread neither could grasp. She told herself it was foolish to dwell on a man she didn't even know, and yet, each time she passed the cafe, her heart would quicken with the faint hope of seeing him again. Winter had begun to creep into the city, its icy fingers lacing the streets with frost, and Eleanor wrapped her scarf tighter as she made her way down the boulevard. The holiday season had arrived, and the city was adorned with sparkling lights and festive decorations. But despite the cheer in the air, she felt a lingering melancholy. Her thoughts, still clouded by memories of Nathan, were now intertwined with the mystery of the stranger. She hadn't seen him since their last encounter, but her heart remained tethered to the possibility of meeting him again. His presence, though fleeting, had left a mark on her, a quiet longing she couldn't shake. And yet, she knew that this connection, as strange and powerful as it felt, might never amount to more than passing glances and stolen moments. The cafe came into view, its warm light spilling out onto the street, and Eleanor paused. She hadn't planned on stopping, but something in her heart urged her forward. The pull was undeniable, and before she knew it, she was pushing open the door and stepping inside. The familiar warmth of the cafe enveloped her as she entered, the smell of coffee and baked goods filling the air. It was busier than usual, with people huddled around tables, laughing and talking. For a moment, she stood still, her eyes scanning the room, searching. But as before, he wasn't there. Eleanor felt a pang of disappointment, but pushed it aside. She found a small table by the window, away from the crowd, and settled into her seat. The sky outside was overcast, the clouds heavy with the promise of snow. It would fall soon, blanketing the city in silence. As she waited for her coffee, her mind drifted once more to Nathan, the park, the long talks, the future they had imagined together. It all felt so far away now, like a dream she had once lived but could no longer touch. The pain of losing him had dulled over the years, but the wound had never fully healed. And now, with this stranger weaving in and out of her life, the old ache had resurfaced, bringing with it questions she hadn't asked in a long time. Could she ever feel that deeply again? Could she open herself up to the possibility of love after all she had lost? The waiter brought her coffee, placing it gently on the table, and Eleanor thanked him with a nod. She stirred the drink absently, her thoughts tangled in the threads of past and present, unable to make sense of the emotions swirling inside her. Outside, the first snowflakes began to fall, dancing softly in the wind. The city, so full of life and movement, seemed to slow as the snow covered the streets, muffling the sounds of cars and footsteps. Eleanor watched the snow through the window, her heart heavy but calm. There was a peace in the stillness, in the way the world seemed to pause for a moment, allowing her to sit with her thoughts in silence. And then, as if by some quiet magic, the door to the cafe opened, and he walked in. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she saw him, his dark coat dusted with snowflakes, his presence as striking as ever. Her heart raced, the familiar pulse surging through her once more. She tried to keep her gaze steady, her movements composed, but inside, she was a storm of emotion. He didn't notice her at first, his eyes scanning the room before settling on an empty table near the back. Eleanor watched him as he made his way to the table, his movements calm and deliberate, the same quiet grace she had noticed before. He sat down, ordered a drink, and for a moment, their paths had crossed once more, both of them sitting in the same space, separated by only a few feet. The snow continued to fall outside, painting the world white, but inside the cafe, the air felt charged, as if something unseen connected them. Eleanor couldn't take her eyes off him. There was something about his presence that filled the empty spaces inside her, a sense of possibility that stirred her soul. As she sat there, her coffee growing cold, her thoughts wandered to the moments they had shared, the glances, the unspoken connection that seemed to bind them together. She wondered if he felt it too, if he thought about her in the quiet hours of the night the way she thought about him. Or was she simply a passing face in a sea of strangers, easily forgotten? The minutes stretched on, and though Eleanor wanted to approach him, to finally break the silence that had lingered between them for so long, something held her back. It wasn't fear, exactly, but rather a deep understanding that their connection wasn't ready to be spoken. It was fragile, delicate, and to act too soon might shatter whatever it was that had begun to grow between them. Instead, she remained where she was, watching him from across the room, her heart beating in time with the snow falling softly outside. The world around them seemed to fade, and for a brief moment, it was as if they were the only two people in existence, bound together by something invisible, something neither could name. He finished his drink, stood, and made his way toward the door. Eleanor's heart sank as she realized he was leaving, and once again, they would part without a word. But as he reached the door, he paused, his hand resting on the handle for a moment longer than necessary. He turned slightly, his eyes sweeping the room, and then, as if drawn by the same invisible force that had brought them together time and again, his gaze found hers. Their eyes met, and in that single glance, Eleanor felt everything. The longing, the uncertainty, the quiet hope that had been building inside her. He looked at her with the same intensity, as if seeing her for the first time. And for a heartbeat, time seemed to stop. But then, just as quickly, the moment passed. He turned and stepped outside into the snow, disappearing into the swirling white flakes. Eleanor sat still, her heart pounding in her chest, the weight of the unspoken moment settling over her like a blanket of snow. She didn't know what the future held, didn't know if their paths would cross again, but she knew that something had shifted. As she rose from her seat and stepped outside into the snow-covered streets, the cold air stung her skin, but her heart was warm with the quiet certainty that this wasn't the end. Whatever it was between them, this thread of fate that kept pulling them together, it wasn't finished yet. The snow fell softly around her as she walked, her steps slow and deliberate, her thoughts no longer consumed by the past but focused instead on the possibilities of the future. For the first time in a long time, Eleanor felt a quiet hope stir in her heart. She didn't know where this connection would lead, but she was ready to find out. Chapter 6. The Weight of Unspoken Moments. The days after their silent encounter felt different for Eleanor, as if the world had subtly shifted around her, nudging her towards something unknown. The snow had continued to fall, blanketing the city in a soft, silent cover, and each day that passed felt quieter than the one before. Yet within that silence, there was a sense of anticipation, a feeling that something was about to change. Eleanor found herself returning to the cafe more frequently, drawn by the possibility of seeing him again. The stranger had become more than just a passing thought now. He was a constant presence in her mind, a mystery she longed to unravel. She told herself that she shouldn't be so consumed by someone she didn't know, but it was useless to fight the pull. Her routines felt incomplete without the hope of their paths crossing, and each time she entered the cafe, her heart raced with the possibility of finding him there. The weight of their unspoken connection grew heavier with each day, pressing down on her thoughts and filling her heart with questions she couldn't answer. What was it about him that captivated her so deeply? Why did their silent glances feel more powerful than any conversation she had ever had? And most of all, what would happen if they finally broke the silence that lingered between them? The winter sun was low in the sky one afternoon as Eleanor stepped out of her apartment and into the snowy streets. Her breath came out in visible puffs of white as she made her way through the city, the chill in the air biting at her cheeks. She wasn't planning on going anywhere in particular, but her feet seemed to have a mind of their own, carrying her back toward the cafe. She passed by the holiday decorations that adorned the windows of the shops along the boulevard, the sparkling lights and festive displays doing little to lift the weight in her chest. It was the season of joy and celebration, but Eleanor felt none of it. Her thoughts were too wrapped up in the stranger, too consumed by the unspoken emotions that had been building between them. As she approached the cafe, a sense of unease settled over her. She wasn't sure if she could handle another day of waiting, of hoping to see him and being met with disappointment. But she couldn't stop herself from looking. The need to know if he was there, if their connection still lingered, was too strong. The cafe was busy when she entered, filled with the sounds of people chatting and the clatter of cups and saucers. Eleanor felt the familiar rush of anticipation as she scanned the room, her eyes moving over the crowded tables. And then she saw him. He was sitting at a table near the back, his posture relaxed as he gazed out the window. Snowflakes danced on the other side of the glass, but his attention seemed focused inward, lost in thought. The sight of him sent a wave of emotion through Eleanor's chest, a mixture of relief, excitement, and a deep, quiet longing. Without thinking, she made her way toward the counter and ordered a coffee. Her movements felt automatic, her mind too preoccupied with the weight of his presence to focus on anything else. She couldn't stop her eyes from drifting toward him, drawn by the same invisible force that had brought them together time and time again. As she waited for her drink, Eleanor found herself replaying their previous encounters in her mind. Each glance they had shared, each fleeting moment of connection, had left a mark on her heart, deepening the bond she felt with him. But today felt different. Today, the weight of their silence was heavier than ever, and Eleanor wasn't sure how much longer she could bear it. Her coffee was ready, and she took it to a table by the window, a few seats away from where he sat. She didn't want to be too obvious, didn't want to intrude on his space, but she also couldn't bring herself to leave. Not when he was so close. Not when the thread that tied them together felt so strong. For a while, she simply sat there, sipping her coffee and staring out at the snow-covered streets. But her thoughts were elsewhere, her heart pounding in her chest as she felt his presence nearby. She could sense him, the same way she had sensed him in all their previous encounters, and the pull between them felt almost unbearable. Minutes passed in silence, the air between them thick with unspoken emotion. Eleanor could feel her pulse quickening, her breath growing shallow as the tension built inside her. She wanted to say something, to break the silence that had defined their relationship for so long, but the words wouldn't come. It was then that she noticed something, a small, almost imperceptible shift in his posture. He had turned slightly in his seat, his gaze no longer focused on the window but on her. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat as she realized he was watching her, his eyes filled with the same intensity she had felt so many times before. For a moment, neither of them moved. They simply sat there, locked in a silent gaze that spoke louder than any words ever could. The cafe around them seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them, their connection raw and undeniable. Eleanor felt her chest tighten as the weight of the moment pressed down on her. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when everything would change. But instead of relief, she felt a wave of fear. What if breaking the silence ruined everything? What if speaking the words that lingered in her heart shattered the fragile bond they had built? The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating, but neither of them moved. Their eyes remained locked, and in that moment, Eleanor felt something shift inside her. The fear, the uncertainty, the longing. It all collided in her chest, and for the first time, she realized that their silence was more than just a lack of words. It was a language of its own, a way of communicating the depth of their connection without ever speaking aloud. She didn't need to say anything. He didn't need to say anything. Everything they felt, everything they needed to express, was already there, hanging in the air between them. The moment stretched on, the world outside the cafe continuing in its usual rhythm while Eleanor and the stranger remained suspended in their own quiet reality. The snow continued to fall, the cafe remained busy, but all Eleanor could focus on was him. His eyes, his presence, the unspoken bond that tied them together. And then, as if by some unspoken agreement, the tension began to ease. The intensity in his gaze softened, and he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture so subtle that Eleanor might have missed it if she hadn't been watching him so closely. But she saw it, and in that moment, she knew that he felt it too, that same pull, that same unspoken connection that had brought them together time and again. Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her chest loosening as the weight of the moment began to lift. She didn't need to say anything. Neither did he. They had already said everything they needed to with their silence. The snow outside grew heavier, blanketing the city in a thick, white cover. The cafe remained warm and bustling, but for Eleanor, the world felt calm. She wasn't sure what would happen next, wasn't sure where their story would go from here, but for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. She took one last sip of her coffee, placed the cup on the table, and rose from her seat. As she walked toward the door, she glanced back at him one more time, her heart swelling with the quiet certainty that their story was far from over. Outside, the cold air bit at her skin, but the warmth inside her heart remained. The snow crunched beneath her boots as she made her way down the street, her mind still buzzing with the weight of the moment they had shared. Eleanor didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. Their connection, their unspoken bond, was something real, something that had grown quietly between them, nurtured by silence and chance encounters. And whatever happened next, she was ready to see it through. As the snow fell around her, Eleanor smiled to herself, her heart light with the knowledge that the story was only just beginning. Chapter 7: Shadows of Doubt. The days following their last encounter passed in a blur for Eleanor, filled with an inexplicable mixture of longing and unease. Although their silent connection had grown, something unsettled her. She spent her time moving through the familiar motions of her daily life, working at the art gallery, wandering through the streets of the city, sipping coffee at the cafe. But her thoughts were always elsewhere. They were always on him. Each time she passed the cafe, her feet itched to go inside, to see if he was there. But something held her back now. Something was different. The bond they had shared in that wordless moment felt too intense, too overwhelming, and she wasn't sure how to handle it. The silence between them had been their only language, but now, the weight of that silence was growing heavier, casting shadows of doubt over her heart. Eleanor walked through the gallery one afternoon, her eyes scanning the paintings on the walls. She had always found comfort in the art, in the brushstrokes that conveyed emotion without words. But today, she couldn't focus. Each image blurred before her, and she felt as though her mind was wrapped in a fog. Even the vibrant colors of the abstract pieces, the ones she usually loved so much, failed to lift her spirits. She knew why she was feeling this way, but admitting it was harder than she expected. The stranger, the man who had become such a central part of her thoughts, was beginning to haunt her in a way that felt more like a burden than a blessing. She didn't know his name, didn't know anything about him, and yet she had allowed herself to become so entangled in the mystery of who he was. What if their silent connection was nothing more than a fleeting moment? What if she had imagined the significance of it all? These questions plagued her as she wandered the gallery halls, her fingers trailing absently along the edges of the frames. The more she thought about him, the more she questioned everything. And with each passing day, the distance between them seemed to grow wider. The air outside was cold, biting. As Eleanor left the gallery that evening, she pulled her coat tighter around her, her breath puffing out in white clouds as she walked through the snow-covered streets. The city felt darker today, as though the winter had finally sunk its claws into every corner. Lights flickered in the windows of shops and apartments, but even they seemed dimmer than usual. She walked aimlessly for a while, not sure where she was going. Her mind was filled with swirling thoughts, doubts, and uncertainties. She tried to push them aside, to focus on the present moment, the crunch of the snow beneath her feet, the chill of the air on her skin, but it was impossible. The stranger had taken root in her mind, and no matter how hard she tried to pull him out, he remained there, an unshakable presence. As she turned a corner, the familiar sight of the cafe came into view. Her heart skipped a beat, and she hesitated for a moment. She wasn't sure if she could face seeing him again, wasn't sure if she was ready for the intensity of their unspoken connection. But at the same time, she couldn't walk away. Not yet. Eleanor stepped inside, the warmth of the cafe enveloping her like a blanket. The soft hum of conversation filled the air, but to her, it was nothing more than background noise. Her eyes immediately scanned the room, searching for him. He wasn't there. A strange mixture of relief and disappointment washed over her as she realized he was absent. She wasn't sure what she had been hoping for, perhaps some kind of resolution to the feelings that had been building inside her. But instead, all she felt was an empty space where he should have been. She ordered a coffee, her hands trembling slightly as she held the cup. She took a seat by the window, staring out at the snow as it continued to fall, soft and silent. The world outside felt so distant, so removed from the inner turmoil that swirled within her. For what felt like hours, she sat there, her mind racing with thoughts of him. The connection they had shared, the glances, the moments of silent understanding. It had all felt so real, so profound. But now, she wasn't sure. Was it possible that she had built this up in her mind, that she had created a fantasy out of a fleeting encounter? The questions gnawed at her, each one more painful than the last. She had allowed herself to become so vulnerable, so open to the idea of this unspoken bond. And now she was faced with the possibility that it had all been in her head. As the hours ticked by, the cafe began to empty. The once bustling space grew quieter, and soon, it was just Eleanor and a few other lingering patrons. The baristas were cleaning up, preparing to close for the night, but Eleanor couldn't bring herself to leave. The silence in the cafe matched the silence in her heart, and for a moment, it felt like the right place to be. But then, the door opened. Eleanor's heart leaped into her throat as she turned to see who had entered. And there he was. The stranger stepped inside, brushing snow from his coat as he made his way toward the counter. His movements were calm, unhurried, as though he had no idea how much his presence affected her. Eleanor's breath caught in her chest, her pulse quickening as she watched him. He hadn't noticed her yet, hadn't seen that she was sitting just a few tables away. But she saw him, and in that moment, all her doubts and fears melted away. There he was, the man who had become a silent part of her life, the one who had stirred something deep inside her. And as he ordered his drink, as he took his seat at a table across the room, Eleanor felt the weight of everything they hadn't said pressing down on her once more. But this time, it didn't feel so heavy. Maybe she had overthought it all. Maybe the doubts and fears that had plagued her were just shadows, illusions created by her own insecurities. Because in that moment, as she watched him sit down and take a sip of his coffee, everything felt right again. Their connection wasn't something she had imagined. It was real. It was unspoken, yes, but it was powerful. And as she sat there, staring out at the snow, Eleanor knew that she couldn't let her fears hold her back any longer. She had to trust in the silence, trust in the moments they had shared, and trust that whatever happened next, it would be worth the risk. The night wore on, and the snow outside grew thicker, but inside, Eleanor felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the cafe's heaters. It was the warmth of hope, of quiet certainty. Their story wasn't over yet. And as the minutes passed, Eleanor made a silent vow to herself. She would no longer let doubt cloud her heart. She would embrace the connection they shared, no matter how strange or uncertain it felt, because some things didn't need words to be understood. Chapter 8. The Unseen Distance. As days turned into weeks, Eleanor found herself increasingly consumed by the invisible thread connecting her to the stranger. The quiet moments they had shared in the cafe, the unspoken understanding that passed between them, had grown into something undeniable, yet intangible. She could feel his presence even when he wasn't around, like an echo in her heart that wouldn't fade. But the longer this silent bond stretched, the more it seemed to fray at the edges. Winter continued its relentless grip on the city, casting a veil of frost over everything. Eleanor's footsteps crunched against the ice-covered pavement as she made her way through the streets, bundled tightly against the biting wind. Her coat was thick, but it couldn't protect her from the cold gnawing at her from the inside, the cold of uncertainty and longing. Each time she walked past the cafe, she hesitated, her feet faltering as if they were tethered to the ground. She had stopped going inside as often. Seeing him there had become too much, yet not enough. They had shared moments, glances across a room, shared silences that felt full of meaning, but the meaning was growing harder to decipher. What had once seemed profound now felt hollow, as if they were drifting further apart despite never having truly been together. One afternoon, Eleanor found herself in the park where she had first seen him. The snow lay thick on the ground, undisturbed except for the occasional set of footprints. She walked slowly, her boots sinking into the soft whiteness with each step. The trees stood bare against the gray sky, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out in all directions. She remembered the last time she had been here, when her heart had been so full of possibility. Now, as she stood in that same spot, staring out over the frozen pond, she felt only the weight of what was slipping away. In the distance, she saw someone approaching. Her pulse quickened for a moment, the familiar spark of hope igniting inside her. But as the figure came closer, she realized it wasn't him. It was just another passerby, bundled up against the cold, lost in their own thoughts. Eleanor's heart sank, the spark quickly extinguished. She turned away from the pond and kept walking, her breath visible in the frigid air. Back at her apartment, Eleanor sat by the window, staring out at the city below. She watched as people hurried along the sidewalks, heads down against the wind, each of them lost in their own world. It was a strange comfort, knowing that everyone around her was carrying their own burdens, their own silent stories. But it didn't ease the ache inside her. The stranger remained a constant in her mind, a presence that lingered even when he wasn't there. She thought of the way he had looked at her across the room, the way his eyes had seemed to understand her without words. But now, it felt like that understanding had slipped through her fingers. She had become so wrapped up in the idea of their connection that she hadn't noticed the growing distance between them. Was it all in her head? Had she built something up that didn't truly exist? The more she thought about it, the more she questioned everything. She had tried to convince herself that their silence was meaningful, that it was enough. But now, the silence felt suffocating, a reminder of all the things left unsaid. Eleanor spent more and more time at the gallery, throwing herself into her work in an attempt to distract herself. She curated new exhibits, meticulously arranging the pieces, hoping that the art would fill the void in her heart. But even the most beautiful paintings couldn't hold her attention for long. She would find herself staring out of the windows, her mind drifting back to him. She had seen him only a handful of times since that night in the cafe, but each encounter had been the same, fleeting, distant, and filled with the same quiet tension that had once excited her but now left her feeling empty. She had begun to wonder if their connection had ever been real at all, or if it was just something she had imagined in the depths of her loneliness. One evening, after the gallery had closed, Eleanor stood before a painting that had always captivated her. It was an abstract piece, filled with swirling colors and chaotic brushstrokes, yet there was something harmonious about it. It reminded her of the way her emotions felt, chaotic yet somehow tied together by an invisible thread. She stared at it for a long time, hoping to find some clarity, some answer to the questions that had been plaguing her. But there were no answers. She left the gallery and walked through the city, the cold night air biting at her skin. Her feet carried her automatically to the cafe, though she hadn't planned on going there. She stood outside for a moment, staring through the window. The warmth inside contrasted sharply with the freezing streets, and for a brief second, she considered turning around and walking away. But she didn't. Eleanor stepped inside, the familiar hum of conversation and clinking of cups greeting her like an old friend. She scanned the room, her eyes searching for him. He wasn't there. Relief and disappointment mingled in her chest as she found a seat by the window. The cafe was quieter tonight, fewer people than usual, and she found a strange comfort in the solitude. As she sat there, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, she thought about the stranger. She thought about all the moments they had shared, the silent exchanges that had once felt so significant. But now, sitting in the very place where their connection had first sparked, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been lost along the way. The snow fell outside, blanketing the city in silence. Inside, the cafe was warm and cozy, but Eleanor felt cold, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. She sipped her coffee, her mind racing with thoughts of him. She had built him up in her mind, turned him into something more than just a stranger. But now, she wasn't sure if that connection had ever truly existed. As the night wore on, Eleanor made a decision. She couldn't keep waiting for something that might never happen. She couldn't let herself be consumed by the idea of him, by the silence that had come to define their relationship. It was time to let go, to stop chasing a connection that seemed to be slipping further and further away. She finished her coffee, stood up, and left the cafe. The cold air hit her like a wall as she stepped outside, but this time, she welcomed it. She pulled her coat tighter around her and walked away from the cafe, her footsteps steady and sure. The city stretched out before her, quiet and still beneath the falling snow. And as she walked through the streets, Eleanor felt something shift inside her. The invisible thread that had tied her to the stranger was still there, but it was no longer pulling her in the same direction. It was loosening, fraying at the edges, and she was beginning to let it go. For the first time in weeks, Eleanor felt a sense of peace. The connection she had shared with the stranger had been real, but it wasn't everything. There was more to her life, more to her story than the silent moments they had shared. And as she walked through the snow-covered streets, she realized that she was ready to find out what came next. The night was cold, but Eleanor's heart felt lighter than it had in a long time. Chapter 9. The Echo of the Past. Winter's grip on the city grew tighter, its icy fingers tracing patterns on every surface, turning the world into a crystalline tableau. Eleanor found herself lost in this frozen landscape, each day blending into the next in a haze of snow and solitude. The cafe had become a distant memory, a place she once frequented but now felt like a chapter from a past she was trying to leave behind. Her apartment was her sanctuary, a space filled with the muted colors of winter. The window overlooked the city streets, where the snow fell in continuous flurries. Inside, the warmth of the radiator was a constant, but it did little to chase away the lingering chill of her thoughts. Eleanor busied herself with her art, but even the most immersive projects failed to pull her from the spiral of introspection. One evening, as she worked on a new piece, a sudden memory from her past surfaced, unbidden. It was a day from her childhood, one she hadn't thought of in years. She saw herself in a sunlit garden, a place full of color and life, far removed from the muted tones of her current reality. Her younger self played with a group of friends, their laughter echoing through the garden as they ran around, chasing each other among the flowers. The memory was vivid and joyful, a stark contrast to the gray city she now inhabited. Eleanor set down her brush and closed her eyes, letting the memory wash over her. It was a reminder of a time when life was simpler, when the only concerns were the small troubles of youth and the joys of friendship. The contrast between then and now was jarring, and she couldn't help but feel a pang of nostalgia. She wandered around her apartment, her gaze falling on old photographs and trinkets that had gathered dust. Each item held a fragment of her past, moments that had shaped who she was but seemed so distant now. She picked up a photograph of her and her family, taken on a summer vacation years ago. They were all smiling, carefree, with the sun setting behind them in a warm, golden glow. It was in this quiet contemplation that Eleanor realized how much she had changed. The carefree days of her youth had given way to a life filled with complexity and unspoken emotions. The stranger had been a catalyst for introspection, but the real journey was understanding her own evolution and how she had arrived at this point in her life. As the snow continued to fall outside, Eleanor felt a growing need to reconnect with her roots, to rediscover the parts of herself that had been buried beneath the weight of her recent experiences. She decided to take a trip back to her childhood home, a place she hadn't visited in years. It was a decision driven by a deep-seated need to find some semblance of clarity. The journey was long, the roads winding through snowy landscapes and quiet towns. Eleanor drove through the wintry terrain, her thoughts drifting back to the days when life had felt simpler. The drive was both calming and unsettling, a time for reflection as she moved further away from the city that had become her world. When she finally arrived at her childhood home, it was as if she had stepped into another world. The house stood nestled among snow-covered trees, its windows glowing warmly against the cold. It looked much the same as she remembered, though the garden was now blanketed in white. She stood there for a moment, taking in the sight, feeling a deep sense of connection to this place. Eleanor spent the first few days reacquainting herself with her old surroundings. She walked through the house, touching the familiar surfaces, remembering the stories associated with each room. She wandered through the garden, now dormant under the snow, and recalled the summers spent playing there, her childhood friends long since scattered. One morning, she ventured to a nearby park, a place she had often visited with her family. It was a serene, snow-covered expanse, the bare trees standing like silent sentinels over the frozen ground. She found a bench and sat there, letting the silence envelop her. The world around her was hushed, the only sounds the gentle crunch of snow beneath her feet and the occasional call of a distant bird. As she sat there, Eleanor felt a sense of peace that had been elusive for a long time. The connection she had felt with the stranger seemed to fade into the background, replaced by a more profound understanding of herself and her past. The memories of her childhood, the innocence of those days, and the warmth of her family were a balm to her weary soul. Days passed, and Eleanor's time in her childhood home began to draw to a close. She had come seeking clarity, and in the quiet moments of reflection, she found it. The past had offered her a renewed sense of self, a reminder of who she was beyond the complexities of her recent experiences. It was a grounding force, a touchstone that helped her see her current situation in a new light. As she prepared to leave and return to the city, Eleanor felt a mix of sadness and anticipation. She was leaving behind the comfort of her past, but she was also taking with her a renewed sense of purpose. The journey had been more than just a physical return. It had been a journey to reconnect with the essence of who she was. The drive back to the city was quiet, the snow falling softly around her. The landscape seemed less daunting now, more like a canvas waiting for her to create new memories. Eleanor knew that she had changed, but she also understood that change was a part of life's natural rhythm. She had faced the echoes of her past and found a new sense of clarity. Back in the city, Eleanor's apartment awaited her, and with it, the possibility of new beginnings. The stranger was still a part of her story, but the connection they shared had taken on a new perspective. It was no longer the sole focus of her life. Instead, she had found a balance between the past and the present, between her own needs and the unspoken bond she had with him. As she settled back into her routine, Eleanor felt a renewed sense of hope. The world outside was still covered in snow, but she was ready to embrace the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. The echo of the past had guided her to this moment, and now she was ready to step forward into the future with a clearer understanding of herself and her place in the world. And so, Eleanor continued her journey, carrying with her the lessons of the past and the promise of what was to come. The city, the snow, and the stranger were all part of her story, but they were no longer the sole determinants of her happiness. She had found a new path, one that was uniquely her own, and she was ready to follow it, step by step. Chapter 10. The Threads of Change. With the arrival of spring, the city began to shed its winter coat. The snow melted away, revealing patches of green that had lain hidden beneath the icy surface. Eleanor returned to her apartment with a renewed sense of purpose, her time away having provided her with clarity and a fresh perspective on her life. The changing season mirrored the transformation she felt within herself, as if the world was awakening along with her. The city was vibrant with the signs of renewal. Flowers began to bloom in the parks, their colors bright against the fresh green of the grass. The sidewalks were dotted with people enjoying the warmer weather, their spirits lifted by the sun's return. Eleanor found herself drawn to these signs of life, taking long walks through the revitalized city, letting the energy of spring infuse her with a sense of hope. One afternoon, as she strolled through a bustling street market, Eleanor came across a stall selling handmade crafts. Her eyes were caught by a collection of delicate, intricately woven tapestries. Each piece told a story through its patterns and colors, and Eleanor felt an inexplicable pull towards them. She spent time examining each tapestry, admiring the craftsmanship and the stories they conveyed through their woven threads. The tapestries became a metaphor for Eleanor's own journey. Each thread, each pattern, represented a different part of her life, her past, her present, and the possibilities of her future. She chose a tapestry that resonated deeply with her, one that depicted a complex but harmonious design of intertwining lines and vibrant colors. It felt like a reflection of her own path, one that had been filled with twists and turns but was ultimately leading towards a new and meaningful direction. With the tapestry in hand, Eleanor returned to her apartment and hung it on the wall. It became a focal point in her living space, a daily reminder of the interconnectedness of her experiences and the beauty that could emerge from life's complexities. The vibrant colors of the tapestry seemed to breathe new life into her surroundings, invigorating her space with a fresh energy. Spring continued its progress, and Eleanor found herself inspired by the season's transformation. She spent more time outside, soaking in the sunlight and the renewed sense of possibility that came with it. She visited the parks, watched the cherry blossoms bloom, and enjoyed the simple pleasure of walking amidst the growing greenery. Each step felt like a step towards a brighter future. Her work at the gallery also began to flourish. With a new sense of purpose, Eleanor approached her projects with renewed enthusiasm. She curated exhibits that celebrated themes of renewal and change, drawing on her own experiences and the inspiration she found in the vibrant season. The gallery became a reflection of her journey, a place where the beauty of transformation was celebrated through art. One evening, as the sun set and cast a golden hue over the city, Eleanor decided to take a walk to the cafe once more. It had been months since she had last visited, and though she had moved on from the connection she had once felt with the stranger, she wanted to revisit the place that had been a significant part of her journey. The cafe, now bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun, looked inviting. Eleanor stepped inside, the familiar aroma of coffee and pastries enveloping her. She found a seat by the window, where she could watch the world outside as she sipped her drink. The cafe was lively, filled with conversations and laughter, a stark contrast to the quiet, introspective visits she had made in the past. As she sat there, Eleanor reflected on her journey. The stranger was a part of her past, a chapter in her story that had helped her grow. She had learned to embrace the complexity of her own life, finding beauty in the interplay of her experiences and emotions. The tapestry she had chosen, with its intricate design and vibrant colors, was a symbol of this newfound understanding. The cafe, once a place of uncertainty and longing, now felt like a place of reflection and acceptance. Eleanor had come to terms with the reality of her past and the silent bond she had shared with the stranger. She understood that their connection had been a catalyst for her personal growth, but it was no longer the focal point of her life. She had moved beyond it, embracing the possibility of new beginnings and the beauty of change. As the evening drew to a close, Eleanor finished her drink and prepared to leave. The cafe's warm, inviting atmosphere had provided her with a sense of closure, a final acknowledgement of the journey she had undergone. She stepped back out into the cool spring air, the city lights twinkling around her as she walked through the streets. With each step, Eleanor felt a renewed sense of purpose. The threads of her life, once tangled and uncertain, had woven together into a pattern of growth and renewal. She was ready to embrace the future with open arms, confident in the knowledge that her journey had led her to a place of understanding and acceptance. The city, now fully awakened from its winter slumber, seemed to pulse with the promise of new possibilities. Eleanor's heart, once heavy with the weight of unanswered questions and unspoken connections, now felt light and free. She had found her way through the complexities of her own life and was ready to move forward with a renewed sense of hope and purpose. As she walked through the springtime streets, Eleanor embraced the beauty of the season and the promise it held. The tapestry she had chosen, the vibrant colors and intricate patterns, served as a constant reminder of the interconnectedness of her experiences and the beauty that could emerge from life's challenges. She was ready to face whatever lay ahead, confident in her own strength and the wisdom she had gained from her journey. Chapter 11. The Unspoken Bond. As summer arrived, the city transformed into a vibrant tapestry of life. The streets buzzed with activity, the parks filled with families, couples, and friends enjoying the warmth and sunshine. Eleanor felt the energy of the season infusing her with a renewed sense of vitality. The days were longer, the nights warmer, and the world seemed to be in full bloom, mirroring the transformation she had undergone in her own life. Eleanor's apartment was a reflection of the season. She had decorated it with fresh flowers, their colors bright and cheerful against the backdrop of her modern, minimalist decor. The sunlight streamed in through the windows, casting a warm glow over her living space. The tapestry she had bought hung prominently on the wall, its vibrant colors a constant reminder of the interconnectedness of her experiences. Despite the outward changes, Eleanor found herself grappling with an internal shift. The connection she had once felt with the stranger was no longer as vivid in her mind, but the impact it had on her remained. It was as if their unspoken bond had planted a seed within her, one that had grown and evolved into something more complex and profound. One sunny morning, Eleanor decided to visit the botanical gardens, a place she had often frequented in the past. She wanted to immerse herself in nature, to experience the beauty of summer in a setting that offered tranquility and inspiration. The gardens were lush and vibrant, filled with a dazzling array of flowers and plants from around the world. The scent of blooming flowers mingled with the fresh summer air, creating a sensory feast that enveloped her. As she wandered through the gardens, Eleanor was struck by the diversity of life around her. Each plant, each flower, was unique yet contributed to the overall harmony of the garden. It reminded her of the threads of her own life, each experience, each relationship, contributing to the tapestry of her existence. She marveled at how the seemingly disparate elements came together to create something beautiful and cohesive. Eleanor spent hours exploring the gardens, taking in the sights and sounds of summer. She found a quiet spot by a pond, where she sat on a bench and watched the dragonflies darting above the water. The tranquility of the scene provided her with a moment of reflection. She thought about the stranger and the unspoken bond they had shared. While their connection had faded, it had been an integral part of her journey, shaping her understanding of herself and her place in the world. In the midst of her contemplation, Eleanor noticed a couple walking hand in hand along a nearby path. They moved with a sense of ease and familiarity, their silent communication speaking volumes. Their presence was a poignant reminder of the various forms of connection that existed in the world, some spoken, some unspoken, but all meaningful in their own way. As summer progressed, Eleanor found herself increasingly drawn to the idea of exploring new horizons. She began to consider the possibility of traveling, of experiencing different cultures and perspectives. The thought of stepping out of her comfort zone excited her, and she began to make plans for a trip abroad. It was a way to embrace the next phase of her journey, to continue growing and learning. She spent time researching destinations, imagining the experiences that awaited her. The idea of traveling became a source of inspiration, fueling her creativity and motivating her to push her boundaries. She envisioned herself in vibrant markets, exploring ancient landmarks, and immersing herself in the richness of new cultures. One day, while organizing her belongings for the trip, Eleanor came across a box of old letters and keepsakes from her past. She had forgotten about them, but as she opened the box, memories flooded back. The letters were from friends and family, each one a snapshot of a different time in her life. She read through them, savoring the personal touches and the heartfelt messages. The letters served as a reminder of the connections she had made throughout her life, both spoken and unspoken. They highlighted the importance of relationships and the ways in which they had shaped her. The experience was both nostalgic and empowering, reinforcing the idea that every connection, no matter how fleeting, had contributed to her growth. As the departure date for her trip approached, Eleanor felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. It was a new chapter, one filled with unknowns and possibilities. She had embraced the lessons of the past and was ready to move forward with a sense of purpose and adventure. On the day of her departure, Eleanor stood at the airport, her suitcase packed and ready. The anticipation of the journey ahead filled her with a sense of exhilaration. She took one last look at the city she was leaving behind, feeling a deep appreciation for the experiences that had led her to this moment. The flight was long, but Eleanor used the time to reflect on her journey. The stranger, the cafe, the tapestry, each had played a role in shaping her path. She understood that their unspoken bond had been a catalyst for her personal growth, helping her to embrace change and find a deeper understanding of herself. As the plane touched down in a new city, Eleanor felt a surge of excitement. The world was full of possibilities, and she was ready to explore them. The connections she had made, both spoken and unspoken, had prepared her for this moment. She was ready to immerse herself in new experiences, to continue weaving the threads of her life into a rich and vibrant tapestry. The new city greeted her with its own unique charm. The streets were bustling with activity, the air filled with the sounds of a different language, and the architecture was a blend of historical and modern influences. Eleanor was eager to dive into the experience, to explore the unfamiliar and embrace the adventure that lay ahead. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor immersed herself in the culture of the new city. She visited museums, explored markets, and tried new foods. Each experience was a discovery, a chance to see the world through a different lens. She took in the sights and sounds, allowing herself to be fully present in each moment. The journey was transformative. Eleanor found herself growing in ways she hadn't anticipated, learning from the people she met and the places she visited. The trip was a testament to the power of embracing change and the importance of stepping out of one's comfort zone. As she prepared to return home, Eleanor reflected on the journey she had undertaken. The stranger and the unspoken bond had been a significant part of her story, but they were just one chapter in a much larger narrative. The experiences she had gained, the lessons she had learned, and the growth she had achieved were all integral to her journey. The flight back was filled with a sense of fulfillment and anticipation. Eleanor was eager to return to her apartment, to see the tapestry that had come to symbolize her journey. She was returning with a new perspective, a renewed sense of purpose, and an appreciation for the connections that had shaped her path. As the plane landed and she stepped back into the familiar city, Eleanor felt a deep sense of gratitude. Her journey had been one of self-discovery, growth, and adventure. She was ready to embrace the next chapter of her life, knowing that the threads of her past and present would continue to weave together into a rich and meaningful tapestry. With a heart full of hope and a spirit renewed by her experiences, Eleanor looked forward to the future. The city, the tapestry, and the unspoken bond were all part of her story, but they were no longer the sole focus of her journey. She had embraced the beauty of change and the power of new beginnings, and she was ready to move forward with a sense of excitement and possibility. Chapter 12: The Reflections of Tomorrow. As autumn settled over the city, a new chapter in Eleanor's life began to unfold. The crisp air and golden leaves marked a period of reflection and transformation. The vibrancy of summer had faded into the warm, muted tones of fall, and with it came a sense of completion and readiness for the future. Eleanor had returned from her travels with a fresh perspective, eager to integrate her experiences into her daily life. Her apartment had become a sanctuary of warmth and comfort. She had redecorated it to reflect the changing season, adding cozy throws and candles that flickered gently in the soft light. The tapestry she had bought still hung on the wall, its colors now harmonizing with the autumnal hues that surrounded it. It was a constant reminder of the journey she had undertaken and the intricate connections that had woven together her life. One morning, Eleanor decided to visit a nearby art studio that had recently opened. The studio was known for its exhibitions showcasing local artists and providing a space for community creativity. Eleanor was drawn to the idea of immersing herself in the artistic spirit of the city, finding inspiration in the work of others as she continued to explore her own creative passions. The studio was housed in a charming old building, its exterior adorned with ivy and its windows showcasing the vibrant artwork inside. Eleanor walked through the entrance, greeted by the warm, inviting atmosphere of the space. The walls were lined with an eclectic mix of paintings, sculptures, and mixed media pieces, each one reflecting the unique vision of the artist. She wandered through the gallery, taking in the diversity of styles and themes. The artwork ranged from abstract to realistic, each piece telling its own story through colors, textures, and forms. Eleanor felt a deep connection to the creative energy of the space, her mind buzzing with ideas and possibilities. As she moved through the gallery, her gaze was drawn to a series of paintings that depicted various stages of a journey. The artist had captured the essence of transformation, illustrating the emotional and physical changes that occur as one navigates through life. Eleanor was particularly struck by a painting that featured a winding path through a forest, with the changing seasons represented along the way. It was a powerful metaphor for her own journey, a visual representation of the phases she had experienced. The painting resonated with her deeply, and she spent a long time studying it, reflecting on its meaning. The winding path, the interplay of light and shadow, and the changing colors of the forest all seemed to mirror her own experiences. Eleanor felt a renewed sense of clarity and purpose, inspired by the artwork to continue exploring her own creative expression. In the following weeks, Eleanor began working on a new series of paintings inspired by her recent experiences and the artwork she had seen at the studio. She poured her emotions and insights into each piece, using the canvas as a means of processing and expressing her thoughts. The paintings evolved as she worked, capturing the essence of her journey and the lessons she had learned along the way. One afternoon, while working on her latest piece, Eleanor received an invitation to participate in a local art exhibition. The exhibition was themed around the concept of transformation, and Eleanor felt that it was an opportunity to share her own journey through her art. She accepted the invitation with enthusiasm, excited about the chance to showcase her work and connect with others who had been on their own paths of change. The preparation for the exhibition was both exhilarating and challenging. Eleanor spent hours curating her collection, selecting pieces that best represented her journey and the themes she wanted to convey. She carefully arranged the paintings, ensuring that each piece complemented the others and told a cohesive story. As the day of the exhibition approached, Eleanor felt a mix of anticipation and nervousness. The event was to be held in a large gallery, and she was eager to see how her work would be received. She took the time to prepare her speech for the opening night, wanting to share the story behind her artwork with the attendees. The night of the exhibition arrived, and the gallery was filled with people admiring the art on display. Eleanor stood near her collection, observing the reactions of the visitors as they moved from piece to piece. She noticed how people were drawn to the paintings, their expressions thoughtful and engaged. It was a gratifying experience, seeing her work resonate with others and spark conversations about transformation and change. The exhibition was a success, and Eleanor received positive feedback from the attendees. Many people were moved by the emotional depth and visual storytelling of her paintings. The experience was validating and fulfilling, reinforcing her belief in the power of art to communicate and connect. As the exhibition came to a close, Eleanor felt a sense of accomplishment and contentment. The journey she had embarked upon had come full circle, and she was grateful for the opportunities and experiences that had shaped her path. The stranger, the cafe, the travels, and the art had all contributed to her growth and self-discovery. With the exhibition behind her, Eleanor looked forward to the future with a renewed sense of purpose. She continued to work on her art, exploring new themes and techniques as she sought to expand her creative horizons. The city, the changing seasons, and the connections she had made all played a role in shaping her journey. As autumn gave way to the approaching winter, Eleanor found comfort in the cyclical nature of life. The seasons were a reminder of the constant ebb and flow of change, and she embraced each phase with an open heart. The tapestry of her life continued to evolve, with each new experience adding depth and richness to her story. Eleanor's reflections on her journey had led her to a place of acceptance and gratitude. She understood that the unspoken bond with the stranger, while significant, was just one part of a much larger narrative. The connections she had made, the lessons she had learned, and the creative expression she had found all contributed to the fabric of her life. As she prepared for the winter months, Eleanor felt a sense of peace and readiness. The year had been one of transformation and growth, and she was eager to embrace the future with a heart full of hope and a spirit renewed by her experiences. The journey was ongoing, and she looked forward to the new chapters that awaited her, knowing that each step would continue to weave together the threads of her life into a tapestry of beauty and meaning. Chapter 13. The Dawn of New Beginnings. Winter's embrace had settled over the city, blanketing it in a soft, shimmering layer of snow. The once vibrant streets were now hushed under the gentle quiet of the season, and the world seemed to be wrapped in a serene, reflective stillness. Eleanor welcomed the arrival of winter with a sense of calm and anticipation, knowing that it signified not only the end of a year, but also the beginning of a new chapter in her life. Her apartment, now adorned with winter decorations, exuded warmth and coziness. She had decorated with evergreen garlands, twinkling lights, and a fragrant fir tree that stood proudly in the corner of her living room. The soft glow of the lights created a magical ambience, inviting her to relax and reflect on the year that had passed. As the snowflakes fell gently outside her window, Eleanor spent her days preparing for the new year. She took time to evaluate her journey, to acknowledge the growth and transformation that had occurred over the past months. The tapestry she had once hung on her wall now seemed even more significant, its vibrant patterns and colors representing the myriad experiences that had woven together her story. Eleanor began the new year by setting intentions and goals. She created a vision board, filled with images and words that resonated with her aspirations. The board was a visual representation of her hopes for the future, a reminder of the dreams she wanted to pursue and the person she aspired to become. It was a powerful tool for focusing her energy and aligning her actions with her goals. One crisp morning, Eleanor decided to take a walk through the snow-covered city. The streets were transformed into a winter wonderland, with each building and tree coated in a glistening layer of snow. The city seemed quieter than usual, the snow muffling the sounds of daily life and creating a sense of peaceful solitude. As she walked through the park, Eleanor admired the snow-covered landscape. The trees, now barren of leaves, were draped in delicate snow, their branches creating intricate patterns against the pale sky. The frozen pond, once bustling with activity, was now a tranquil expanse of ice. Eleanor felt a deep sense of tranquility as she wandered through the park, her breath visible in the chilly air. Her walk led her to a small, secluded bench overlooking the pond. She took a seat and gazed out at the serene scene before her. The stillness of the winter landscape was a stark contrast to the vibrant energy of the city during other seasons. It provided a space for contemplation and reflection, a moment of quiet amidst the busyness of life. Eleanor took out a notebook and began to write. She reflected on the past year, the challenges she had faced, and the accomplishments she had achieved. She wrote about the unspoken bond with the stranger, the travels that had broadened her horizons, and the creative expression she had discovered through her art. Each word was a testament to the journey she had undertaken and the lessons she had learned along the way. As she wrote, Eleanor felt a sense of closure and renewal. The winter season, with its quiet beauty and reflective atmosphere, symbolized a time of rest and preparation for the future. It was a moment to honor the past while looking forward to new opportunities and experiences. After spending time in contemplation, Eleanor stood up from the bench and continued her walk through the park. The snow crunched beneath her boots, and the cold air invigorated her senses. She felt a renewed sense of clarity and purpose, ready to embrace the new year with a fresh perspective. Back at her apartment, Eleanor began working on her art once more. Inspired by the winter landscape and her reflections, she created a series of paintings that captured the essence of the season. The paintings were imbued with a sense of tranquility and renewal, reflecting the inner peace she had found during her time of reflection. The new year brought with it a sense of possibility and hope. Eleanor continued to pursue her creative endeavors, exploring new techniques and themes in her artwork. She found joy in the process of creation, using her art as a means of expressing her emotions and experiences. Her art was well received by the community, and she was invited to participate in several exhibitions throughout the year. Each event was an opportunity to share her work with others and to connect with fellow artists. The exhibitions became a platform for Eleanor to showcase her growth and to inspire others with her journey. As the seasons changed, Eleanor embraced the natural cycles of life. She found beauty in each phase, from the quiet stillness of winter to the vibrant renewal of spring. Each season brought its own set of experiences and opportunities, and she approached them with an open heart and a sense of curiosity. In the midst of her busy schedule, Eleanor made time for self-care and reflection. She continued to practice mindfulness, finding moments of peace and tranquility in her daily life. Her apartment remained a sanctuary, a place where she could retreat and recharge. The year passed, and Eleanor looked back on her journey with a sense of fulfillment. The experiences she had gone through, the people she had met, and the art she had created all contributed to her growth and self-discovery. She had embraced change, found inspiration in the world around her, and connected with her own creativity. As winter gave way to spring once more, Eleanor felt a deep sense of gratitude. The cycle of seasons had come full circle, and she was ready to embrace the new beginnings that lay ahead. The tapestry of her life continued to evolve, each thread adding depth and richness to her story. With a heart full of hope and a spirit renewed by her experiences, Eleanor stepped into the new year with a sense of excitement and possibility. She knew that the journey was ongoing, and she was eager to continue exploring the threads of her life, weaving them into a tapestry of beauty and meaning. The city, the seasons, and the connections she had made were all part of her story. Eleanor embraced the future with confidence, knowing that each new chapter would bring its own set of challenges and opportunities. She was ready to face them with an open heart and a sense of purpose, prepared to continue weaving the intricate and beautiful tapestry of her life.